In 2019, Emily still believed that effort and love could sustain any world that threatened to collapse. She was a science teacher at a public school in Columbus, Ohio, and lived with her son Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with a degenerative heart condition who turned every day into a small miracle. Their apartment smelled of disinfectant and chamomile tea, and in the corner of the living room there was always a constant hum, the oxygen machine that gave the boy the hours fate denied him. Emily had learned to read the sounds of the machines like others read sheet music. Each beep had a meaning, each silence a warning. She slept little, ate just the right amount, and had forgotten the last time she thought about herself. Since Ethan's father disappeared one morning, unable to bear reality, her life had been reduced to 3 words: work, care, and endure. Her parents lived about 15 minutes away, in a house with an impeccable facade, surrounded by rose bushes and neighbors who considered them an example of a stable family. Her father, Harold, was a man with a firm gaze and measured words. Her mother, Linda, was the typical woman who smiled without conviction, more out of habit than emotion. And then there was Claire, the youngest daughter, the undisputed favorite, with her advertisement-worthy smile and light linen dresses. While Emily counted coins to buy medicine, Claire posted photos in expensive restaurants and talked about her dream wedding in Tuscany. Emily never admitted it, but there was a hole in her chest that came not from her son's illness, but from her parents' uneven love. She was the practical daughter, the one who solved problems, the one who didn't complain, the one who was used to family gratitude always going to the wrong addressee. The first time she heard the number, $85,000, Emily thought she had heard wrong. The doctor, in the gentlest voice he could muster, explained that this was an experimental treatment at a clinic. In Texas, there were no guarantees, but there was hope. It was, in essence, Ethan's last chance. Emily left the hospital with her hands shaking and her heart torn between fear and determination. She knew she didn't have the money. Her salary barely covered rent, medications, and overdue bills. However, she also knew her son couldn't wait. That same night, she printed out all the medical reports and sat down at the computer to make a list. Loans, fundraisers, selling the car, family support. At the bottom of the page, she underlined a word that almost burned her fingers: parents. 2 days later, she showed up at their house, holding a blue folder and feeling anxious that made her stomach hurt. Harold greeted her at the doorstep, surprised to see her unannounced. In the living room, Linda was making coffee, and Claire, visiting, was looking through bridal gown catalogues. Emily couldn't help but glance at the prices on the open pages, figures that, together, could save a life. She explained the treatment, showed the documents, and spoke of the prognosis. When she finished, the silence was so thick she could barely breathe. Her father cleared his throat and said they should think about retirement, that the risks were too high for something without guarantees. Her mother nodded with a warm sadness, not daring to contradict him. Emily didn't scream, didn't cry. She just got up, gathered the papers, and, as she left, thought she had never felt so cold in the middle of summer. Over the next few days, Emily moved like a ghost between school, the hospital, and her home. In the classroom, she smiled at the children while her mind calculated impossible numbers. In the hallways, she hid the dark circles under her eyes with cheap makeup and words of encouragement. At night, she watched Ethan sleep, hooked up to tubes and flashing lights, and wondered how it was possible that his parents, the same ones who had once tucked her in when she had a fever, could turn a blind eye to their grandson's suffering. She tried not to hate them, but resentment lodged in her throat like a lump she couldn't swallow. She knew it wasn't enough to ask for help. In that family, empathy was a luxury reserved for appearances. One Sunday, while searching for documents for an online fundraiser, Emily discovered Claire's post announcing her wedding in Italy. "Our parents will make my dream come true," the caption read, accompanied by photos of the vineyard where the event would be held. In that instant, the air seemed to leave her lungs. 8 days ago, she'd been denied $85,000 to save a life. Now they were spending almost 3 times that much to celebrate a wedding. She closed her computer with a thud and stared at the wall, without tears, without anger, only with a feeling of absolute emptiness. That was the exact moment something inside her broke, and she decided she would no longer beg for love from those who had never known how to give it. Unconditionally. The following weeks had the metallic taste of resistance. Emily sold the car, pawned an inherited ring, and started a campaign featuring photos of Ethan holding a drawing of a crooked heart. At work, she coordinated experiments with vinegar and baking soda, while inside she juggled bills and deadlines. Sometimes, to save money, she turned off the heat and boiled water in a pot to bathe the boy. When she returned from the hospital, the building smelled of instant soup and bleach. It was the sour aroma of survival. Linda called one afternoon to invite her to try on the bridesmaid dress. $300, she said, as if pronouncing the price of a scented candle. Emily looked at the bottle of Ethan's medication and calculated 2 weeks of respite. She replied that she couldn't. Her mother sighed with that tone of inverted guilt that turns necessity into rudeness, and added that Claire would be hurt. Emily hung up and listened to the ticking of the wall clock, the one that marked equal minutes for very different pains. She understood that nothing would change there. Winter arrived early that year, and with it a silence that seeped through the cracks in the soul. Emily had become an expert at feigning normalcy. She taught classes about the solar system with the same calm as she organized pills in a plastic pillbox. And she smiled when she heard her students' laughter, even though inside she counted the days Ethan's heart could still hold out. At night, she tucked him into a blue blanket that smelled of cheap detergent and old hope, and read him stories about stars that never go out. Sometimes, when the boy was fast asleep, she would turn off the lights, sit by the window, and gaze up at the sky as if waiting for something, a miracle, a sign, a modicum of mercy to descend from the darkness. But all that fell was snow, slow and silent, covering the world with an indifference so perfect it hurt. Ethan began to worsen in mid-January, his once rosy. Lips turned the color of porcelain, and each breath sounded like a thread stretched too thin. The doctors spoke of palliative care, with the rehearsed coldness of someone who has repeated the phrase too many times. Emily listened with a strange serenity. She didn't scream, didn't demand explanations. She just nodded, as if that sentence confirmed what she already knew. As she left the hospital, the icy air hit her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt she didn't want to go home. She wandered aimlessly until she saw a store with windows full of wedding dresses. In one of them, she recognized the exact model Claire had chosen. She smiled bitterly. The dress cost more than the treatment that could have saved her son. In that reflection, amidst white lace and warm lights, she understood that purity doesn't always come in what it appears to be. That night, the apartment was filled with a silence so thick it seemed to have a weight of its own. Emily sat next to Ethan's bed and stroked his hair, soft as if afraid of breaking it. The boy slept hooked up to the machine that emitted a constant, almost hypnotic hum. Outside, the wind battered the windows, the sound mingling with the irregular dripping of the humidifier. Emily thought of all the times her mother had said that every family has its cross, never imagining hers would weigh so heavily. On the kitchen table, the bottle of the last prescription was almost empty. Glancing at the clock, she saw it was 3 a.m., and for a second she wished she could stop time. She wanted to believe there was still a chance that some invisible force would listen to her. But the world, as always, kept turning without looking at her, unaware that in that corner of Ohio, a mother was silently losing her war. 2 days later, Ethan didn't wake up. The hospital was filled with soft voices, quick footsteps and lights that hurt her eyes. Emily didn't remember crying. She only felt a chill creep up her spine and numb her hands. When a nurse placed a blanket over her shoulders, she barely reacted. She was told that her son had passed without pain, as if those words could bring any relief. As she signed the death papers, she heard a Christmas song playing in the background from the hallway speaker. It seemed cruel, almost obscene, that the world was still celebrating. Outside, the sky was a pale grey, and a light snow covered the asphalt. Emily left the hospital with a plastic bag containing Ethan's belongings. Stuffed animal, a bracelet from his admission, and a drawing of a crooked heart. All that remained of 7 years of struggle could fit into a single hug she could no longer give. The funeral was held 3 days before Claire's wedding. Emily didn't want a wake, just a brief ceremony in the hospital chapel. The few attendees, a colleague, a neighbor, the pediatrician, formed a silent semicircle as the priest spoke empty words that drifted into the air. When Emily's parents arrived, they were dressed to the nines. Linda wore a beige coat and a gold flower-shaped brooch. Harold wore a dark suit that smelled of expensive perfume. They apologized for the delay and mentioned almost in a whisper that the wedding rehearsal had been longer than expected. Emily didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the small white coffin, as if waiting for the silence to reveal something words couldn't. When the earth fell onto the wood, the sound was dry and final. That afternoon, under the grey sky, she realized that the love of her family had died long before her son. After the burial, Emily returned home alone. On the dining room table, Ethan's mug was still half full, bearing a faded drawing of a rocket. He sat across from it and remained still, staring into the vapor that no longer existed. Her phone vibrated, a message from her mother asking her to move up the formal funeral so as not to interfere with the celebration. Emily read the sentence several times, as if the words could have another meaning. They didn't. At that moment, something broke inside her, not with the thunder of grief, but with the calm of exhaustion. It was then that she decided there would be no more pleading, no more waiting. She took a blank sheet of paper and wrote a list with 3 columns: debts, closed accounts, broken promises. And beneath it all, in large, shaky letters, she wrote, "Never again." The wedding day arrived with a relentless sun that contrasted with the emptiness in Emily's chest. She didn't attend, of course. Instead, she walked to the lake where she used to take Ethan on Sundays, that small corner with wooden benches and the smell of damp pine. She sat there for hours, watching the reflection of the water that moved as if breathing. Sometimes the laughter of the children playing nearby struck her with an unbearable tenderness. She didn't think of revenge. She didn't have the strength for even that. She only felt a deep desire to disappear, to become silence, air. At some point in the afternoon, a blue butterfly landed on her knee. It was absurd and beautiful, and for the first time since Ethan's death, Emily breathed without pain, as if that tiny creature reminded her that even in loss there could be something like life. Months passed, and routine became her refuge. Emily returned to work, taught about ecosystems and chemical reactions, and feigned enthusiasm for school projects. No one mentioned Ethan. People avoided his story like someone avoiding an open wound. At night, she organized the boys' notebooks, x-rays, hospital letters, everything meticulously stored in a metal box. Each object had a distinct weight, a texture of memory that hurt just to look at. Her parents didn't call, and Claire from Tuscany posted photos with her new husband, surrounded by flowers and smiles. Emily watched those images in silence, not with rage, but with icy clarity. She no longer expected divine justice or human remorse. She only waited for the moment when life would somehow balance the scales. The years began to smooth the edge of pain, but not the memory. Emily completed a master's degree at night in educational administration while continuing to work full-time. Her days were a succession of early mornings, reheated coffee, and classrooms full of children who looked at her curiously, unsure of what story she was carrying. She moved to a slightly larger apartment, with mint-colored walls and plants in the windows, as a small gesture of reconciliation with life. Her colleagues saw her as a strong, disciplined woman, capable of handling anything. No one imagined that. When she got home, Emily would sit on the kitchen floor and listen to old recordings of Ethan laughing, as if by closing her eyes she could reconstruct a world that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the perfect family began to crumble. Harold lost his management position amid a corporate scandal that made the local papers. Linda sold jewelry to pay lawyers, and Claire moved to another state to escape the rumors. The house with the rose bushes became filled with for sale signs and awkward silences. Ironically, the same man who denied Emily $85,000 to save her son now needed $90,000 to keep from losing everything. That's when the phone rang. It was Linda, her voice cracking, and she didn't recognize it at first. "We need to talk," she said. Emily heard the echo of those words in her empty kitchen and knew the time had come. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in Emily's small apartment. There was no coffee or cookies on the table, just a thick folder with carefully arranged documents and photos. When Harold and Linda entered, they seemed smaller, as if their shoulders had shrunk with shame. They sat on the sofa with their hands clasped, staring at the floor. Emily, with a calmness she didn't remember possessing, passed them the papers one by one. The budget for the experimental treatment, the emails, pleading for help, Claire's wedding bills. The room smelled of old paper and something metallic, as if the past were rusting right there. Neither of them spoke. Only the ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of the street could be heard. Finally, Emily asked them to say out loud what had happened. Harold swallowed and muttered that they had chosen wrong. Linda burst into tears, haltingly apologizing. Claire, connected via video chat, tried to justify herself, but her voice sounded hollow, lacking arguments. Emily looked at them like someone looking at a familiar painting. She felt neither anger nor satisfaction, only a kind of icy certainty. She then took out a check for $90,000 and placed it on the table. "Here's what you need," she said, "but after this, there will be no more calls or visits, only shared DNA." The three nodded, trembling. In that instant, Emily realized she wasn't exacting revenge. She was signing her own release. When her parents left, their apartment fell into an almost solemn silence. Emily stood for a while, staring at the check envelope that no longer belonged to her. The tabletop bore traces of cups no one had dared to use, along with a strange echo, as if the walls were breathing. She didn't feel immediate relief, but she did feel a profound clarity. She had come full circle. She walked to the window and looked out at the damp street, the car lights reflecting off the pavement. For the first time in years, her hands weren't shaking. She didn't need revenge. Time had already taken care of that. What she was looking for now was something different, something she couldn't even name. Maybe peace. Maybe the feeling of being able to walk without carrying other people's ghosts on her shoulders. That same night, Emily opened the metal box where she kept Ethan's memories. She took out the drawing of the crooked heart, the hospital bracelet, and the faded stuffed animal that had slept beside him until his last day. She placed them on the bed and looked at them silently. Then she took out a new notebook and wrote, "Today I forgive them. Not because they deserve it, but because I don't want to keep bleeding for the same thing." As she finished the sentence, she felt something loosen inside her, as if an invisible cord had finally snapped. She lay back, holding the drawing, and allowed herself to cry for everything she had never said. That night, she didn't dream of hospitals or machines, but of the lake and the blue butterfly. A few weeks passed before Emily told her story for the first time. She didn't do so with tears, but with a newfound serenity that surprised even her. At a school meeting, a colleague confessed that she was about to give up on her sick son, and Emily, without thinking twice, shared fragments of her own journey. The woman listened with tears in her eyes and finally said, "Your story should be heard by more people." That night, when she got home, Emily turned on her laptop and began to write. She wasn't looking for sympathy or praise. She just needed to unburden herself of the weight she had carried in silence for so long. Thus was born the story that many years later others would read as if it were a confession, although in reality it was an act of freedom. And if you're listening to this so far, you probably understand what it means to fight without witnesses, to rise when no one offers a hand. Perhaps you've felt that same silence that can't be spoken about, the one that hides behind a smile so the world doesn't notice the cracks. Tell me from where you're listening. I want to know if, where you are, you also feel this cold, this mixture of tiredness and hope that unites us without knowing each other. Because although each story hurts differently, there is something that unites us. The certainty that even when love fails us, we are still here, breathing out of sheer stubbornness. Over time, Emily's story began to circulate on forums and social media, shared by strangers who saw her words as a mirror to themselves. Some wrote her short messages. "Thank you for saying what I couldn't. Your story gave me strength. I too lost someone because my family chose pride over love." She didn't respond to them all, but read them one by one, with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. It seemed almost unreal that her pain, which had isolated her for years, had now become a bridge between broken hearts. It was as if Ethan, through those letters, continued to touch lives from some invisible place. Encouraged by this unexpected resonance, Emily began giving talks about resilience in small schools and communities. She presented herself not as an expert, but as someone who had learned to survive loss and indifference. She spoke of how love, when used as a bargaining chip, ends up contaminating everything it touches. Her words were simple, but carried the weight of her own experiences. Every time she took to the stage, she carried a small stone in her pocket from the lake where she used to go with Ethan. It was her amulet, her reminder that silence can also be a form of victory. And although her voice sometimes trembled, no one noticed that inside she was still conversing with her son, as if he was still in the front row, listening. The following years were, for the first time, peaceful. Emily was promoted to principal of the school where she had taught for over a decade. She decorated her office with photos of her students, plants and a lamp that emitted a warm light, similar to that of a sunrise. Sometimes, at the end of the day, she would sit alone in the empty building, listening to the echo of her own footsteps, and think about how far she had come since that endless winter. It wasn't happiness she felt, that word felt too light, but a kind of balance, a peace won through scars. Every decision she made bore Ethan's mark, in her empathy with the students, in her patience, in her way of refusing to give in to the small, everyday injustices. One autumn afternoon, while walking through the park, she received an unexpected call. It was Claire. Her voice sounded worn, as if the years had stripped away the superficial shine that always surrounded her. She told her she was divorced, living alone in another state, and thinking a lot about Ethan. Emily stopped under a yellow tree and listened in silence. She felt no hatred, only an impossible distance to bridge. When Claire burst into tears, saying she wished she could go back, Emily calmly replied, "Sometimes life doesn't give us second chances, only the chance to learn." She hung up without rancor, feeling that finally the past had been put right. The wind blew hard, but for the first time it didn't make her shiver. As time passed, Emily began to travel, not for pleasure but out of a deep need to close the loop. She visited the sea for the first time in decades and carried with her a small urn containing part of Ethan's ashes. She walked along the shore at dawn, when the sky was tinged with orange and lilac hues, and threw a handful of ashes into the wind. The air lifted them before they touched the water, and for a moment she thought she saw the silhouette of the boy running through the waves. She cried, but not from sadness. It was a different farewell, a mixture of gratitude and liberation. In each city she visited, she left a little more ash, as if sowing pieces of love in different places around the world, places where grief no longer held power. During one of those trips, in a small coastal town, she met a group of veterans who provided therapy to sick children. She volunteered without a second thought. She helped them with basic science classes and small educational activities, while listening to their stories of loss and courage. In her own way, she found in them a reflection of herself, people who had learned to live with wounds that time doesn't erase. Every smile from those children was a reminder that life, even in its most broken form, still had meaning. In the eyes of those veterans, she saw a quiet strength similar to her own, that of those who have seen death up close and yet choose to build something with what remains. In that coastal resort, Emily felt for the first time in many years that she belonged somewhere. She woke up early to help with community breakfasts and spent her afternoons explaining to the children how stars, even when they die, continue to shine for centuries. That metaphor had become her personal mantra, the idea that the light of something we love can continue to travel, even when its source is no longer there. At night, she wrote in a notebook the lessons she learned from each person she met. Some days the veterans invited her to dinner. Other days they simply shared comfortable silences by the sea. There she understood that love doesn't always come from blood or promises, but from chance encounters that restore what the past has shattered. Years later, a local news network wanted to interview her about her educational work and her work with the families in the program. Emily hesitated, but accepted. During the interview, she spoke about her son without naming him, referring to him only as the reason I understood that life is worthwhile even when it hurts. The note went viral, and hundreds of people contacted her to thank her for her kind words. Many said they had reconciled with their own memories, others that they had found the courage to forgive. Emily read each message with moist eyes and a calm smile. She wasn't looking for admiration or applause. She just wanted her story to help someone, somewhere, decide not to give up. Over time, the small help center grew, becoming a support network that offered emotional counseling and free workshops for families facing loss. Emily took on the role of coordinator, though she insisted she wasn't a leader, but rather a survivor sharing her journey. Drawings from the children hung on the walls, and one in particular, a twisted heart with wings, became the symbol of the program. Every time she saw it, Emily felt a pang of nostalgia, but also a warmth that sustained her. It was as if Ethan, from some corner of the universe, kept sending her signals to remind her that it had been worth it to endure. On the anniversaries of his birth, she would bring flowers to the sea and tell him about the center's progress, as if still awaiting his approval. One day, while sorting through the center's correspondence file, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. She recognized her mother's handwriting, shaky and aging. It said that Harold had died months before, and that his last wish was for Emily to know that he admired her, even though he never said so in life. Linda asked for forgiveness, not for what they had done, but for not having the courage to love properly. Emily folded the letter slowly and put it in her jacket pocket. She didn't cry. She walked to the dock, where the sea roared loudly, and threw the letter into the water. She watched it float for a few seconds before sinking. "Now it's done," she murmured. Forgiveness, she thought, isn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it's simply surrendered to the sea. That evening, Emily returned to the centre and found the children gathered around a veteran telling stories of the ocean. She sat among them, unannounced, and let their laughter sweep over her. For the first time in decades, she felt an almost childlike lightness. She thought about how, for so long, she had sought justice, when what she really needed was redemption. In that instant, she understood that her greatest triumph had not been repaying her family's indifference with grace, but having transformed pain into something useful. She looked at the walls decorated with photos, at the hopeful faces, and realized that her life was no longer defined by what she lost, but by everything she chose to build afterward. As the center closed for the night, Emily walked to the beach. The moon was high, and the sea stretched out like a silver sheet. She took a small box she'd carried with her for years from her pocket. Inside were Ethan's last ashes. She knelt on the damp sand and opened the lid. "Today we end this journey, son," she whispered. The wind gently blew the dust away, as if the universe responded to her gesture. She stood there for a long time, watching the waves erase their footprints. For the first time, she didn't feel emptiness or sorrow, but a calm that enveloped her completely. The same calm that only comes when you've survived everything and still choose to continue loving. In the following days, something changed in the way she looked at the world. Emily began to enjoy the simple things: the smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of seagulls at dawn, the rough feel of the wood on the benches on the pier. She began writing a book, not about tragedy, but about the way resilience is, inherited like a flame that never goes out. In its pages, she recounted fragments of her life and the people she met at the center, as if each story were a constellation that helped illuminate the darkness of another. She discovered that by telling, she healed, and that by healing she helped others do the same. For the first time, words weren't a refuge, they were a compass. And if you've made it this far, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true love isn't measured in money or forced sacrifices. It's measured in presence, in silent acts, in the ability to stay even when it hurts. Because perhaps, somewhere, another Emily is struggling alone, believing no one will understand. May our voices meet. May this story not be lost. Tell me where you're hearing it from and what part of your life it reminded you of. Sometimes a shared story is enough to make the world, even for a moment, feel a little more human again. Over the years, Emily's book was published by a small independent publisher and became a silent symbol of hope. It didn't appear on bestseller lists, but it traveled from hand to hand, from school to school, reaching people who needed to believe that pain can also be transformed into something beautiful. In the dedication, she wrote only a single sentence: "To Ethan, who taught me that even the most fragile heart can be infinite." When she was invited to present her work at a university, she spoke before a completely silent crowd. It wasn't fame that filled her, but the certainty that her son's love lived on in every word. At the back of the auditorium, a group of children held up drawings of hearts with wings, and Emily smiled with subtle tears. After the conference, she stood alone on the empty stage, staring at the echo of the lights above the chairs. In that moment, She remembered the night her parents turned their backs on her, the cold hospital, the silence of her house after the funeral. And she thought that all of that, cruel as it had been, had led her to that place, to that version of herself capable of turning loss into a lesson. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and felt something resembling total peace. There were no more emotional debts, no unfinished business, no open wounds, only gratitude, and in that final silence she understood that forgiveness wasn't forgetting, but remembering without it hurting. That night, on the way home, the sky was clear and the stars seemed closer than usual. Emily walked slowly, enjoying the cool air on her skin. When she opened the door to her apartment, the scent of chamomile enveloped her like an ancient hug. The metal box, now empty, was still on the table, but she didn't dare put it away. She liked seeing it there, reminding her that even emptiness can have meaning. She lit a candle and poured herself a cup of tea. As the steam rose, she thought the cycle had finally come full circle. She was no longer the woman pleading for help, or the mother, sinking into despair, but someone who had learned to live with memory without letting it define her. And at that thought, something inside her smiled. The next morning she woke up early, opened the curtains, and let the sunlight flood the room. Outside, the city continued its routine. Children with backpacks, cars speeding by, the world turning as always. Emily took a deep breath and for the first time felt in sync with that movement. She walked to the mirror, looked at herself for a long time, and with a newfound serenity whispered, "We did it, Ethan." Then she grabbed her bag and headed downtown, where the children and veterans were waiting for her to begin another day. Each step she took resonated like a silent affirmation. She had survived, she had forgiven, and above all, she had learned to love unconditionally.